some of the first evidence that these may be a true technodelic. That is to say, a non-pharmacological intervention that recapitulates not only the phenomenology, the downstream behavioral outcomes, but importantly, the neural mediators associated with psychedelics and advanced meditative states. So first, you've heard about chills a couple times at the conference. I don't have to go through the whole shebang, but suffice to say that what's very interesting about chills and compelling from a phenomenological perspective is that they're a unique crossing of three very interesting things. One, they are associated with a strong and consistent phenomenology. Two, they're associated with the process of insight and belief updating. And third, really importantly, is that although they are a subjective experience, they're associated with an implicit marker that can be identified neurophysiologically, a somatic, fairly unmistakable sensation. So over 3 decades, disparate findings have pointed to the fact of having a positive transformative role. They're associated heavily with reward circuitry. They're associated with interoception, that is to say they are embodied. They're associated with prosociality. Chills make people behave more prosocially, more generously in economic gains. And importantly for this talk, they're associated with ameliorating the symptoms of depression, associated with reversing maladaptive beliefs, and importantly, doing this via the self-transcendent states that we associate with psychedelic therapy. So this is actually maybe the most substantiated set of findings we've had in the lab, which is over the course of at least 4 studies and counting in multiple different cohorts, over and over again, we have robustly found that the presence of aesthetic chills is associated with all the classical aspects of mystical transformative experience. Ego dissolution, connectedness, moral elevation and emotional breakthrough, and psychological insight. This has been replicated now in over 4,000 subjects, including 120 on-site subjects we'll get into now. And what these suggest is maybe chills could be a true micro-mystical experience, one that we encounter in everyday life. So the main question that we seek to explore that has not been explored by past work in an on-site study is, are chills in fact acting to update the brain's priors? So it's unclear yet whether they reproduce the neural complexity changes that are thought to drive psychedelic and contemplative outcomes via the entropic brain hypothesis. It's unclear whether those neural changes drive the outcomes. And importantly, to avoid simply being caught in correlational results, we wanted to actually drive some causal juice through the pipes, as it were, by actually augmenting the chills and seeing if that caused this measurable changes to both the neural signatures and the downstream behavior. So, well, how do we measure the chills, obviously, right? First, that's the main thing. Well, on one hand, we have physiology and neural measures, and then importantly, we have an active sort of Bluetooth-connected clicker button by which people could do an ecological momentary assessment while listening to chills-evoking stimuli to assess the onset and presence of chills, which allow us to actually identify epochs in the EEG signal when chills are actually happening versus not. And then how do we, importantly, augment chills? This is the really cool part. So we actually use a frisson prosthetic developed by Felix Scholler that uses 3 Peltier elements that actually cool down with a very quick delta and allow us to deliver a 3-second pulse of cold that goes up the spine at key moments during the stimuli, not to replace chills, but to actually augment them, to add more boost into this signal of monitoring and then output and meaningfulness. The stimuli themselves are from the chills database, which we published in 2023 and 2024, the update. And this is a crowdsourced in over 3,000 subjects, empirically validated and publicly available database of publicly available songs and speeches. We picked the very top ones, so songs that over and over again were able to cause chills in over 80% of subjects. And we used those to be sure that we could be able to elicit them consistently on site in the laboratory. And we can share those songs with you at any time. So this is the design of the study. I'm not going to cover every detail of it because of limited time, but suffice to say that we had an initial session where we looked at baseline, a series of trait measures, as well as a behavioral task called the dictator game, where you share money with anonymous strangers in the community, with real money and real people, so real states, ecologically valid, a task which we've used in other studies. Then people were exposed to the 3 chill stimuli. Half of the subjects received the prosthetic augmentation, half of the subjects did not, though they still had the prosthetic on their back. We recorded EEG and physio throughout, and then afterwards we looked at all these measures of state self-transcendence. We assessed people's maladaptive schemas before and after, and then we examined the post-experiment dictator game prosociality, as well as their behavior in a moral dilemma questionnaire that looked at different aspects of moral reasoning. In terms of the results, contrary frequency, likelihood, phenomenology, virtually anything did not see direct effects. However, the picture is more complicated than that, as we'll get into, and maybe why that is also. What we did see is in the neural data, neurophysiological data, there was a coherent cortical signature of chills, which I'll go into. Here we're seeing the time courses for illustration, which means there's a lot more juicy questions to ask, but suffice it to say for now, we'll look at the correlates, the main features extracted. So the first in band power were changes, actually it turns out quite typical of psychedelic experiences, a drop in theta, a hike in gamma, essentially a shift towards a higher frequency sort of paradigm, which has been associated with the psychedelic and transformative states. And importantly, well not equally important, let's say, increases in 4 independent measures of neural complexity. So Lepel-Ziv, Higuchi fractal dimension, permutation entropy, sample entropy. And then when we're examining the phenomenology and the neural signatures, we find that this seems to be a kind of dose-dependent response. So the more chills that people got, the more intense chills they got, the more intense the downstream phenomenology. However, self-reported chills did not predict any of the more implicit measures, the social behavior, the schema updating, though again, these are metacognitive assessments done after the fact, not the same as the ecological momentary assessment. Also, importantly, or interestingly, because I think it's closer to the source, the mechanism, we found that changes in the neural entropy, regardless of the group that people were in, stimulated or not, increased neural entropy and diminished criticality, in often the case, predicted downstream outcomes. Everything from the phenomenology, so psychological insight, connectedness to self, other, and world, ego dissolution, moral elevation, you name it, to also changes to actual non-compliant or non-strategic altruism. So dictator game offers, utilitarian preferences and moral reasoning, and changes to 2 maladaptive schema in particular. One, shame, so diminished sense of deep-seated beliefs around the shamefulness of the person, and social isolation. And then what's interesting now is that when we had a prior hypothesis, right, that neural changes would actually mediate the effect of the device, and as it turns out, this was the case. And there's a couple reasons for this, which I'll discuss at this time, but it does appear that the device did in fact have an effect on multiple neural signatures, complexity and band power, and then those ones in turn had a downstream effect on the behavior. So again, across phenomenology, across strategic, non-strategic generosity, across moral reasoning, across maladaptive schema, neural signatures, again, in line with the sort of entropic brain hypothesis, seem to mediate the downstream effects of this chills augmenting prosthetic. So I have a couple ideas as to why that might be. So 2 options, which we'll be exploring in future studies. One is that, well, the device, to determine when we triggered the device, we actually used population averages from a prior pilot study. So it's not as if everyone had a personalized thing going, oh, you're getting chills, we'll ping you right there. It was like, well, most people get chills around the spot, we'll ping you. That means there were likely individual differences as to when it hit, which could have had variable effects on the neural mechanisms. Hence, the mediating result from that perspective, under that hypothesis, is that depending on how effective the device was, it would have a variable effect, but still in a certain direction, depending on how effective it was on the neural mechanism, which then in turn caused the downstream outcome. So hopefully, with better personalization, we can actually see the direct effect manifest. The other option, which is also interesting, because if you notice, I'm sorry to go over these so quickly, but if you notice, criticality seems to actually increase, whereas entropy seems to drop from the device. What that could also suggest is that the device is not acting just as it's more chills, it's acting as another exteroceptive stimulus via temperature that creates more of a bound sort of experience in time across multiple modalities, hence making more likely to replicate the kind of hyperconnectivity and criticality we see from psychedelics. Anyway, we can dissociate these, right? In terms of why does this matter? Because we've been hearing a lot of debates now between, can we get the downstream outcomes without the experience and just the molecule? Can we get it with the molecule and the experience? And we go, well, why not just the experience with no molecule, right? So sort of, expand the debate, because, these substances are neurochemically promiscuous, right? So sometimes having something where you can just build the experience bit by bit and you can cancel it when you want is very desirable. And And in terms of where we're going from this, well, I already went over how we can use these markers we've now established to have personalized closed-loop stimulation of the prosthetic. We can, as Nico discussed earlier, as Dr. Argente discussed earlier in the talk, we can use personalized music and personalized narratives to target whatever the salient maladaptive schema is of the person and really start to do schema surgery, right? Similarly, in terms of the total sort of E4 project, the Emulating Indications project this is part of, we're starting to see similar results from stroboscopics, from binaural, from haptic stimulation, et cetera. We can start stacking the modalities and really achieve an encompassing hallucinogenic experience. And last, I'm very excited about the notion of what I would call hybridelic protocols, where we combine sort of these psychoplastogenic sort of probes like tabernanthalog with neurostimulation, like vagal nerve stimulation or focused ultrasound, and then use the technodelic experience to truly achieve something that maximizes the positive outcomes while diminishing the adverse outcomes and increasing the accessibility to these non-ordinary states. Which is ultimately, that's the mission of our lab. We want to take it from where we are now with tremendous inequality of access for legal and cultural reasons to a place where everyone has safe access to these states at their own pace and on their own terms. So I'd like to thank all of my colleagues, particularly Felix Scholler, the developer of the prosthetic and the chills expert. I wish he could have been here. Nico Argente, our brave director, over there in the back, and then all the wonderful people who made this happen, as well as all of our sources of funding, which we really couldn't make this happen. And please feel free to stay connected. We have all of our proceedings both in paper form or in